The bailiff brought the crate up from the basement because the podium was built for grown men, and the child was 4 feet 1. She stepped up onto it in her good church shoes, the ones with the scuffed toe her mother had colored in with a blue marker that morning, and she set a black composition notebook down on the wood. On the cover, in a 9-year-old's marker handwriting, was one word: facts. Behind her, her mother was crying without making any sound at all, the way women cry when they have learned that crying loudly costs them something. And Judge Harold Brennan, who had sat on that bench for 26 years and had thrown 4 attorneys out of that room for less than what was happening in front of him, looked down at the little girl and did the thing that would end up costing him everything he had left. He said, "Go ahead, Miss Carter." Nobody in that courtroom moved. 41 people in the gallery, a jury of 12, 2 attorneys, a court reporter with her hands still resting on the keys, and every single one of them was looking at a 4th grader standing on a milk crate in a navy church dress. The radiators along the wall of courtroom 3B were knocking the way old radiators do in February in Connecticut, and that sound is the only thing on the record for the next 11 seconds. 11 seconds is a long time in a courtroom. It is long enough for a prosecutor to decide whether to object. It is long enough for a mother to understand exactly what her child is about to do to her. And it was long enough for one woman in the back row, a woman nobody in that building had ever paid any attention to sit forward in her seat for the first time in 3 years. Before we go any deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what that little girl was carrying in her hand that morning had been sitting in a sock drawer in a rented half house on Cortlandt Street for 1,084 days. It had been through 2 moves, 1 funeral, 1 hospital admission, and a police search that turned over every drawer in that apartment and did not think twice about a child's toy. For adults in that courtroom had spent 3 years and a great deal of money making certain that a certain 40 seconds of sound would never exist anywhere in the world. And not one of them had ever considered that it might be in a sock, under a bed, next to a bottle of children's heart medication. To understand what happened in courtroom 3B on that Tuesday morning in February, you have to go back 4 months, to a house on Bellamy Ridge in Renfield, Connecticut, and to a woman named Naomi Carter, who had been letting herself in through the side door of that house at 20 minutes to 6 in the morning for 14 years. 14 years. Long enough to know which stair on the back staircase would announce her, and to step over it without thinking. Long enough to know that Elise Ashworth took her coffee with a splash of cold water in it, so she could drink it fast, and that Vaughn Ashworth wanted his shirts hung with 2 fingers of space between them, and that if the boys' bedroom door was closed past 11 in the morning, you left the vacuum in the hall and came back after lunch. That October morning was cold enough that the frost was on the inside of Naomi's windshield, and she sat in the driveway of that 11,000 square foot house for a minute with the engine off, doing what she did every morning, which was rolling her shoulders back and putting her face on. Not makeup, a face, the one that did not have any opinions in it. Then she went in through the side door and started the coffee, and she carried a laundry basket up 2 flights of stairs on one hip without stopping to breathe, because at 38 years old and 40 pounds past the girl who had been hired at 24, Naomi Carter could still outwork every landscaper, caterer, and contractor who came through that property. She stopped once at the landing, one hand on the rail. Then she kept going. There were people in Renfield who had opinions about the size of her. She knew about all of them. She knew that Elise's sister called her the Sherman tank because she had been standing 4 feet away holding a tray of champagne glasses the night that sentence was said out loud at a garden party, and everybody laughed. She knew that the woman who did the flowers referred to her as the big one, to distinguish her from the girl who came Thursdays. Naomi Carter had made a decision a long time ago about what she was going to carry and what she was going to set down, and she had set that down. What she had not set down, what she carried up those stairs every morning of her life, was a 9-year-old girl at home with a heart that was too thick on one side, and a folder of medical bills that had a rich man's name on the paid line. At 7:15 that morning, there were 2 Renfield police officers standing in the kitchen. Naomi came down the back stairs with an armful of dry cleaning and stopped on the bottom step, and the first thing she noticed was that Elise Ashworth was not in the room. In 14 years, Elise had never once missed the sound of a car in that driveway. She was upstairs. She was not coming down. Vaughn Ashworth was leaning against the marble island in a quarter-zip pullover with his reading glasses pushed up on his head, and he had a look on his face that Naomi had seen him wear at funerals. And he said, "Naomi, sweetheart, nobody is accusing anybody of anything. This is a formality. This is for the insurance." The Ashworth brooch was a 1911 Cartier piece, a spray of diamonds and platinum shaped like a wheat sheaf, appraised 11 months earlier at $410,000. It lived in a wall safe in the dressing room. The second item was $38,400, moved out of a household account in 11 separate transfers over 9 weeks, an account Naomi had the login for because Elise could never remember passwords and had written this one on a card in the kitchen drawer in her own handwriting. The younger officer asked, politely, almost apologetically, whether Mrs. Carter would mind if they looked in her bag. And Naomi said yes. She said yes immediately, and she reached over and picked her tote up off the chair and set it on the counter herself and opened it wide, because that is what innocent people do. He took out a rain bonnet. He took out a paperback from the Renfield Library with a due date slip in it. He took out a plastic bag of orange slices, cut into eighths and sealed, because Pearl liked them cut that way for after school, and he set it on the marble next to the paperback with the care of a man handling somebody's private life in front of them. And underneath that bag of oranges, in the bottom of a canvas tote from a hardware store, was a small navy velvet pouch with a drawstring. The room went quiet. The officer's face changed. Naomi's face did not change at all, because she had not yet understood what she was looking at. And Vaughn Ashworth arranged his features into shock and held it. And it was a very good performance. And it was about 4 seconds too slow. 14 years she had washed that man's sheets. She had held his wife's hair. She had wrapped his son's Christmas presents at a kitchen table at midnight with her own daughter asleep in a chair beside her. And in the time it took him to look surprised, Naomi Carter understood something that she would not be able to prove to a single living soul for 111 days. She did not say a word. She put her hands behind her back before anyone asked her to. And on a Tuesday morning in October, in a kitchen she had scrubbed on her knees more times than she could count, the accusation that would eventually put a 9-year-old girl on a milk crate in front of a judge began with a man saying, very gently, that nobody was accusing anybody of anything. To understand why Naomi Carter did not say a word in that kitchen, you have to see the other half of her life, the half that started at 4 o'clock every afternoon when she pulled into a gravel spot behind a rented half-house on Cortlandt Street with a heat pump that only worked if you hit it in a particular place with the flat of your hand. Inside that house, at a kitchen table with one leg shimmed by a folded playing card, there was almost always a 9-year-old girl doing long division. Not assigned long division. Long division she made up herself, because she liked the way the numbers came out even sometimes, and she liked the way they didn't come out even the rest of the time. Her name was Pearl Carter. And in the entire state of Connecticut, there was nobody quite like her. Pearl was small for 9, which was part of the heart thing, and she had her father's forehead and her mother's mouth and a black and white composition notebook she carried the way other children carry a stuffed animal. On the front, in blue marker, she had written one word, and the word was facts. Inside that notebook were things people had said, with the date beside them, and the time if she knew it, and the name of the person who said it. She had started keeping it when she was 7. She could not have told you why. She only knew that grown people said things, and then later said they had not said them, and that this bothered her in a place she did not have a word for, and that writing it down made the bothered feeling smaller. On the windowsill above the sink was a plastic pill organizer with 7 doors on it, and inside the doors were small white tablets, twice a day, morning and night. Metoprolol. Pearl could pronounce it correctly at 6. What the medication was for was a thing called hypertrophic cardiomyopathy, which means the muscle of the heart grows too thick on one side, and then has to work harder to push the blood through a smaller door. It is inherited. It came to Pearl from her father, Isaiah Carter, who was a mechanic with hands that never came all the way clean, and who died at 39 years old in his own driveway on a Saturday in June with a socket wrench still in his hand, while his daughter was 5 years old and standing at the screen door. Isaiah had left one thing behind that mattered more than the truck, more than the tools, more than the wedding ring that Naomi wore on a chain because her fingers had gotten too swollen for it. He had left his voice. He had been a man who read out loud. Every night of Pearl's life, from the time she was in a bassinet, Isaiah Carter had sat on the edge of the bed and read to that child. And because he worked doubles sometimes and could not always be there, he had gotten himself a cheap silver voice recorder from a pawn shop on Route 4 and started recording the stories so his wife could press play on the nights he was under somebody's transmission until midnight. There were 41 hours of Isaiah Carter on that recorder. After he died, Pearl slept with it every single night. She kept it in a white tube sock, which drove her mother slightly out of her mind, and she carried it in her backpack, and to the grocery store, and to church, and to the cardiologist. It was voice-activated, which was a feature Isaiah had been proud of for about $8, and which Pearl complained about constantly. She would say, "It wastes tape when the dog barks. It turns itself on for anything. Somebody sneezes on the porch, and it thinks it's a story." She said that sentence, or a version of it, probably 400 times in 4 years, and her mother said, "Then turn it off, baby." And Pearl never did, because turning it off felt like turning her father off, and she was not going to do that for anybody. The story Pearl asked for the most was not from a book. Isaiah had made it up, and he told it slightly differently every time, and it was about an oyster. He would drop his voice down low, doing the accent he did for it, and he would say, "Now, Pearlie, here is what happens. Something sharp gets inside her. A piece of grit, a piece of shell, something that hurts, and it will not come out, no matter what she does. And that oyster does not cry about it, and she does not spit it out. She just puts her whole self around it, over and over and over, in the dark, for years. And by the time she's done, the thing that hurt her is the most beautiful thing in the ocean. That's why you got that name. You understand me. Now, there is a question a person watching this would be right to ask, and the question is this. If the Ashworths were the kind of people they turned out to be, why did Naomi Carter stay in that house for 14 years? And the answer is in a manila folder that Naomi kept in the bottom drawer of her dresser. And the answer is not simple, and it is not flattering, and Naomi herself would tell you that. When Isaiah died, there was no life insurance, because he had let it lapse in March to pay for a transmission job that went wrong. The funeral home in Renfield wanted $6,300 up front. Naomi had $1,100, and Vaughn Ashworth wrote a check on a Tuesday afternoon without being asked, folded it once, and put it in her apron pocket, and said, "We'll never speak about this again." A year and a half later, a pediatrician in Torrington heard something in Pearl's chest that she did not like. What followed was 18 months of appointments in Hartford, and then in Boston, a Holter monitor taped to a 6-year-old's ribs, an echocardiogram every 4 months, and a specialist who did not take the insurance Naomi had. And every time, the invoices came back marked paid, and nobody in that house on Bellamy Ridge ever mentioned it. Vaughn Ashworth had never once asked her for anything in return. That is the part people misunderstand. He never asked. He simply let the debt sit there in the room with them, year after year, the way a man leaves his hand resting on the back of your neck while he tells a funny story, and you laugh, and you do not move. There is one more thing you need before we go forward, and it is the thing everything else in this story stands on. 3 Octobers before that morning in the kitchen, The Ashworth Foundation held its annual gala at the house, and Naomi worked it as a double, 6 in the morning until well past 1, because the caterers only handled the food and somebody had to handle everything else. She had no place to put Pearl, who was 6 years old at the time. So Pearl came along and did what she had done at half a dozen of those parties, which was sit in the mudroom off the garage with a coloring book and a juice box, and eventually fall asleep on the mountain of coats that got piled on the bench by the door. In her sock, as always, was her father. At 10 minutes past 1 in the morning, Naomi came out through that mudroom to get her keys and found the garage door standing open and the cold coming in. Elise Ashworth's silver Range Rover was parked crooked, front end at an angle, half up on the painted line. The passenger side headlight was cracked, a spider of white through the glass. And along the front fender there was a scrape about the length of a man's arm. And inside that scrape there was a streak of dark red paint that was not from that vehicle. Standing beside it, in his tuxedo shirt with the studs undone and his bow tie hanging loose around his collar, holding a garden hose at 1 o'clock in the morning in the last week of October, was Vaughn Ashworth. He smiled at her. That is the detail Naomi would come back to for 3 years, at 2 and 3 in the morning, staring at a water stain on her bedroom ceiling. He smiled. He said, "Dear on Quarry Bend. She's a wreck about it. You know how she is. Do me a favor and don't bring it up with her. She's embarrassed enough." And Naomi Carter, who had a funeral paid for and a daughter with a bad heart and a Boston cardiologist who cost $1,100 a visit, stood in that doorway with her car keys in her hand and looked at a cracked headlight and a streak of red paint and a man with a hose. And she said 2 words. She said, "Yes, sir." Then she went and picked her sleeping child up off a pile of coats and carried her out to the car. 2 days later, the Renfield Register ran it above the fold. A 16-year-old girl named Marisol Vega, walking home on the shoulder of Quarry Bend Road after her shift at the dairy barn because her ride fell through, struck from behind at approximately 10 minutes to 1 in the morning and left there. Driver fled. No witnesses. She had been wearing a dark red jacket. Naomi read that article standing up at her own kitchen counter with her coat still on, and she did not sit down, and she did not call anybody. She thought about the check from Boston Children's taped to the inside of the cabinet door where she could see it every morning. She thought about the sound of her daughter's heart through a stethoscope, which the resident had once described as being like a boot coming down in wet snow. And Naomi Carter folded that newspaper in half, and then in half again, and she pushed it down to the bottom of the kitchen trash under the coffee grounds, and she became a woman with a stone inside her. She would tell you later, under oath, that she told herself a story that morning, and that the story was this: that girl is already gone, and nothing I say puts her back, and my baby is still here. She told herself that story for 3 years. She got very good at it. And every so often, usually on a Sunday, it would come loose in her chest, and she would have to sit down on the edge of the tub with the water running so her daughter would not hear her, and then she would wash her face and go make dinner. The arraignment was on a Thursday. Larceny in the first degree, which in Connecticut is a Class B felony, and when the number came back it was $50,000. Naomi Carter had $1,140 in a credit union account, and a 2009 Corolla with a bad rear strut. What she had instead was a 61-year-old woman named Bernadette Kowalski from 2 doors down, who everybody on Cortlandt Street called Bertie, who had been bringing that family casserole since the week Isaiah died, and who had a paid-off house and no children. Bertie Kowalski sat down at a folding table in a bail bondsman's office in Torrington with a ballpoint pen and signed her home over as collateral for a woman she was not related to. And when Naomi started to speak, Bertie said, "Don't." 2 days after that, Naomi caught Elise Ashworth in the parking garage behind the medical building on Ashman Street. She had been waiting there 90 minutes in a car with no heat. 14 years of history walked toward that woman across a concrete floor. Elise had taught Pearl how to hold a cello bow when Pearl was 4, guiding those small fingers into the shape, laughing. Naomi had sat on the bathroom floor of that house for 2 hours the night Elise lost the second pregnancy, holding her hair, saying nothing, which was exactly what was needed. Naomi did not raise her voice in that garage. She said one sentence. She said, "Elise, tell them I didn't take it." Elise Ashworth dropped her keys. She bent down and picked them up and dropped them again, and her hands were going so badly, she had to press them flat against the door of the car. She did not look at Naomi. She said, and the voice came out of her like a string tuned wrong, "I can't. Naomi, listen to me. I can't. You have no idea you don't know what I'm sorry. I am so sorry." And then she said the 6 words that Naomi Carter would carry around for the next 100 days, turning them over, holding them up to the light. She said, "He said it would be all right for you." Then she got in the car and reversed out so fast the tires barked on the concrete, and she was gone. The letter came the following Monday. Not a phone call, not a conversation, not 14 years of anything. 3 paragraphs on Ashworth Holdings letterhead, signed by an office manager Naomi had never met, terminating her employment effective immediately, citing the household services agreement she had signed in 2011 and had never once read. There was no severance. There was one more line at the bottom, and that line said that her final compensation, 2 weeks and change, would be held pending resolution of the outstanding matter. And with that termination, on the 24th of October, the health insurance that covered a 9-year-old girl with a thickened left ventricle ended at 11:59 that night. Pearl found out about the charges the way children find out about everything, which is from another child. His name was Dylan, and he was in her class, and his father did tile work for half the houses on Bellamy Ridge. And at the lunch table on the 30th of October, he said, loud enough for the table to hear, "My dad says your mom's a thief. He says that's why you're on the free lunch now." Pearl Carter did not cry. She did not hit him, though she thought about it, and she wrote down later that she thought about it. She finished her sandwich. Then she went to the library at recess and asked Mrs. Ipediv where the law books were. Mrs. Ipediv, who assumed this was for a class project, showed her the county interlibrary loan form and helped her fill it out. And over the next 11 weeks, a 9-year-old girl in Renfield, Connecticut checked out, in this order, a plain language guide to Connecticut criminal procedure, a book on the rules of evidence written for paralegals, 2 volumes on chain of custody, and a book about famous American trials that she read twice. She did not understand all of it. She understood more of it than anyone would have guessed. And on the night of October 30th, she opened the composition notebook to a clean page and wrote the date at the top, and underneath it she wrote, Dylan P. said my mother is a thief. He is wrong. I am going to prove it. Here is the part of this story that is hard to sit with, and it is the part that gets left out when people tell it. The case against Naomi Carter was good. It was not thin. It was not sloppy. It was not a small-town frame job you could see through from the back row. The wire transfers were real. 11 of them, $38,400 total, moving out of the Ashworth household account into a holding account at a bank in Rhode Island over 9 weeks. The login credentials belonged to a card in a kitchen drawer that Naomi had used dozens of times to pay the pool service and the propane company. The timestamps were on file. The device identifiers were on file. And a $410,000 brooch had come out of the bottom of her bag in front of 2 police officers. The prosecutor was a 34-year-old assistant state's attorney named Grant Feely, and it matters to this story that Grant Feely was not a corrupt man. He was ambitious. He had a caseload that would have broken most people, and he looked at that file the way any prosecutor in America would have looked at it, and saw a household employee with total access, financial pressure, an expensive sick child, and stolen property recovered from her person. He was not inventing a story. He was reading the one that had been carefully written for him and left on his desk. That is the thing about a well-built frame. It does not require a dishonest prosecutor. It only requires an honest one. And then there was the part where Naomi made it worse. 3 of those 11 transfers happened on nights when Naomi Carter was 31 miles away in Danbury, running a floor buffer through the second story of a professional building on Padanaram Road from 9 at night until 2 in the morning. She had an alibi for 3 of the 11. She had time cards. She had a supervisor who would remember her. She had every reason in the world to hand that to her attorney, and she did not. And the reason she did not was that every one of those time cards said Bernadette Kowalski on it, because the household agreement she signed in 2011 barred outside employment, and because a 50-year-old cleaning contract paid off the books does not care whose social security number it uses. Her public defender was a decent, badly overworked man named Danny Ferrante, and he asked her about those 3 dates 6 separate times. He told her, plainly, in a conference room with a window that did not open, that she was handing the state a conviction. He said, "Naomi, where were you on the 14th?" And Naomi Carter, who had already learned exactly what it costs to speak, looked at the table and said, "I was home." She said it in that quiet voice, the one that meant the door was closed. What she was protecting was a 61-year-old woman on disability who had just put her house up, and the fact that a state agency looking hard at a mother with a fraud problem is a state agency that starts asking who is raising the child. So the audience watching this should understand something clearly, because the state's attorney understood it, and the jury would eventually understand it. Naomi Carter lied, on the record, to her own lawyer, and later under oath in a sworn document. This woman lied more than once, and she had reasons, and the reasons were good, and they were still lies. That is what makes what happened later mean something. This is not the story of a spotless woman crushed by wicked people. It is the story of an ordinary, decent, frightened woman who made a series of small survivable compromises, every one of which made sense at the time, and who woke up one morning 3 years later standing in the middle of the wreckage of all of them. In the second week of November, at a follow-up echocardiogram in Hartford that Naomi paid $400 cash for, a cardiologist turned the screen away and then turned it back and said that the septal wall had thickened measurably since the spring. He used the word obstruction. He said that with this rate of progression, they would need to start talking about a surgical option, a septal myectomy, which is open-heart surgery on a 9-year-old, performed by maybe a few dozen surgeons in the country who are truly good at it. He mentioned Boston. And then, because he had to, he mentioned that with the insurance lapse, the number they were looking at started in the high 5 figures and did not stop there. Naomi drove home from that appointment with her daughter in the passenger seat, asking whether the human heart is technically a muscle or technically an organ, and got the answer she wanted, which is both. She stopped at the light on Route 4 by the pawn shop where Isaiah had bought the recorder, and she put her hand over her mouth, and Pearl said, "Mom, it's green." And Naomi said, "I know it is, baby," and drove. Then in the first week of December, Danny Ferrante was removed from the case. Not fired, not bribed, nothing anyone could point at. His office had previously represented a man who had turned up on the state's witness list, and the conflict was real, and the removal was procedurally correct, and it happened 3 weeks before trial. Her new attorney had 94 open files and met with Naomi Carter for 11 minutes in a hallway. There is no villain in that paragraph. There is only a machine that grinds at the same speed no matter who is in it, and it is more frightening than a villain. And anyone who has ever watched a family member go through a courthouse in this country knows exactly what it feels like. And in the middle of all this, on a Tuesday in December, sitting on a wooden bench outside courtroom 3B waiting on a continuance hearing, Naomi Carter sat down next to a tired woman in nursing home scrubs with a coat folded over her lap. They talked, the way strangers do in a courthouse hallway, about nothing. About their feet. About how the coffee downstairs was $2 and tasted like the cup. The woman said she came to that building a lot. She said it in a way that invited the next question, and Naomi asked it. And the woman said her daughter's name was Marisol, and that she had been 16, and that it happened out on Quarry Bend Road 3 Octobers ago. and that nobody had ever been arrested. Then she asked, without any weight on it at all, "Do you ever drive out that way?" And Naomi Carter said, "No." Here is what Naomi Carter did not know when she said that. 11 days earlier, a detective named Corinne Bayer, for months into a reassignment to unresolved cases, had pulled the Vega file and sent the paint transfer recovered from the girl's jacket and from the roadway back out for analysis using a manufacturer database that had not existed 3 years earlier. It came back into silver, a metallic finish used by one manufacturer across model years 2019 through 2021. Bayer then did the least glamorous and most effective piece of police work in this entire story, which was to pull every registration for that make, model, and color within a 15-mile radius of Quarry Bend Road, and every body shop invoice in 3 counties for front-end and headlight work in the 6 weeks after that night. She came up with a list. She began issuing subpoenas. One of those subpoenas went to a house on Bellamy Ridge. And now you understand the shape of this thing, and you understand what 4 months of a woman's life had actually been about. Because the brooch was never about the brooch. Nobody on Bellamy Ridge needed $410,000. What they needed, urgently, on a specific deadline, was for the only living person who had ever seen that cracked headlight and that streak of red paint to be a convicted felon with a documented history of theft and financial deception before she ever opened her mouth to a detective. Destroy the witness before the witness becomes a witness. That is the whole plan. That is all it ever was. And the timeline proves it, because the first of those 11 wire transfers was made 19 days before Corinne Bayer ever touched that file, which means somebody on that hill had a source and knew what was coming. The offer came on the 9th of January, in a conference room on the 4th floor of an office building in Hartford with a view of the river, delivered by a lawyer in a beautiful suit who was unfailingly kind the entire time. It was, and there is no other word for it, generous. All charges to be dropped. The brooch to be located. In a drawer, an unfortunate misunderstanding, with a public statement clearing Mrs. Carter's name in the register. Reinstatement, if she wanted it, with back pay and a raise. And a $300,000 irrevocable medical trust in the name of Pearl Carter, funded within 10 business days. Boston Children's. The surgeon whose name Naomi had been reading about it too in the morning on a library computer. In exchange, one document. A sworn affidavit stating that on the night of October 19th, 3 years earlier, the vehicle belonging to Elise Ashworth was at Kellner Auto Body in Torrington, and that Naomi Carter had not been in that garage, had seen nothing, had heard nothing, and had no knowledge of any damage to any vehicle belonging to that family at any time. Von Ashworth himself came in at the end, only for a minute, and he did not sit down, and he was warm the entire time, and at the door he said this: "You're not choosing between right and wrong, Naomi. You're choosing between a girl who's already gone and a girl who isn't. I'd make the same choice. Any mother would." She had it in front of her at the kitchen table at 3 in the morning on the 10th of January with a pen in her hand. And the door opened, and Pearl came out for water in her father's old T-shirt that hung down past her knees, and stood there blinking in the light, and said, "Mom, if somebody did something bad to somebody else, and you knew about it, and you didn't say anything, is that the same as doing it?" Naomi said, "Where is that coming from, baby?" And Pearl said, "It's a hypothetical. It's for a thing at school." Then she took her water and went back down the hall. It was not for a thing at school. It was the 22nd question she had written in that notebook, and she had been building toward it for 11 weeks. Naomi Carter signed it. She signed her name the way she had signed for 14 years of packages at that back door, small and neat, taking up as little room on the line as she possibly could. Then she put the pen down and walked down the hall and stood in the doorway of her daughter's room in the dark for a long time, listening to a 9-year-old breathe, listening to a heart that was too thick on one side working and working and working. And she told herself the thing that every decent person tells themselves right before they do the one thing they will never be able to forgive. She told herself that she had no choice. The charges were not dropped. The affidavit was filed on the 15th of January, and Grant Feely, who had been given no warning that the complaining witness's attorney had been sitting in a room with the defendant, was informed of it by fax. He was furious, and he was furious at the wrong person, and he refused to dismiss. He had a brooch, bank records, and now a defendant who had gone around her own counsel to negotiate with the victims, which to a prosecutor looks exactly like consciousness of guilt. Trial was confirmed for the 3rd of February. Naomi Carter had now committed perjury in a sworn document, had sold the only thing she had left that was worth anything, and had received in return precisely nothing. When she reached Von Ashworth on the phone, he was calm and warm and said, "These things take time, sweetheart." He had never intended to protect her. He intended to own her. The trial ran 5 days. Feely put on a clean, unhurried case. He walked the jury through 14 years of unsupervised access, through a card in a kitchen drawer with a password on it in the homeowner's handwriting, through 11 transactions, through a search consented to, and a velvet pouch under a bag of orange slices. He did not sneer at her once, which somehow made it worse. The gallery did the sneering. Naomi Carter sat at a defense table in the same navy coat every day, taking up a chair and a half of it, and she could hear them behind her, and she kept her hands folded and her face on. And in the second row, every single day, in a booster seat she had asked the bailiff for, was a 9-year-old girl with a composition notebook, writing down everything. On the 4th day, the state called Pearl Carter to the stand. He needed her to place her mother in the house on the evening of October 24th, and a 9-year-old cannot be coached and cannot be impeached, and a jury will believe one over almost anybody. Feely was gentle with her. He was, by every account, as decent about it as a man can be while doing that. It was still the worst thing anyone in that room had ever watched. Pearl answered every question exactly, in complete sentences, with the times attached. And when he was finished, Judge Harold Brennan asked whether the defense wished to cross-examine the witness. And Naomi Carter stood halfway up and said, in the smallest voice that courtroom had heard all week, "No, sir. I won't do that to my daughter." And Pearl Carter, still in the witness box, still holding the edges of the chair, said, "Your Honor, may I say something that isn't an answer?" What happened next has been argued about by lawyers in that county ever since. Brennan cleared the courtroom and took it into chambers, and Grant Feely objected 7 separate times on the record, and every objection he made was correct. A 9-year-old witness has no standing to offer anything. There is no mechanism for it. There is one narrow door in the law, and it is called an offer of proof, which is simply the court hearing what evidence would show before deciding whether a jury ever hears it. And Judge Harold Brennan, 14 weeks from a retirement he had been counting down for 2 years, opened that door about 2 inches. And a 4th grader walked through it. She put 3 things on his desk. The composition notebook, a page she had written herself, in pencil, ruled with a ruler, listing every date that object had been in her possession, who had touched it, and where it had been kept, because she had read 2 books on chain of custody and had understood roughly half of what they said. And a scratched silver voice recorder in a white tube sock. Brennan asked her what it was, and Pearl Carter said, "It's my dad. He reads me a story every night. The state said my mother is a liar, and I want the court to hear who taught me not to be one." Every adult in that room believed they were watching a grieving child make a gesture. That is the only reason it happened. Feely did not fight it hard, because he could not see the harm in it. And a hard fight against a 9-year-old in front of a judge is a thing a smart lawyer avoids. And Brennan, for reasons that would not become clear until the following afternoon, allowed it into open court on the record. So on the morning of the 5th day, the jury came back in, and the bailiff brought a milk crate up from the basement, and a child 4 feet 1 inch tall climbed onto it in her good church shoes with the blue marker on the toe, and set down a notebook that said facts and pressed play. And Isaiah Carter's voice came into courtroom 3B. He was reading the oyster story. Unhurried, warm, doing the accent. A man in his own kitchen 4 years dead, talking to his little girl. Asterisk something sharp gets inside her, pearly, and it hurts, and it will not come out. And she does not cry about it, and she does not spit it out. She puts her whole self around it, in the dark, for years. Asterisk 2 jurors were crying by the second sentence. Naomi Carter had both hands over her face. And in the back row, a woman in nursing home scrubs who had been coming to that building for 3 years, who had no connection to this case and no reason on earth to be there, sat forward. Then the story ended, and the tape kept running. Because it was voice-activated, and it turned itself on for anything, and it had turned itself on at 7 minutes past 1 in the morning on the 19th of October, 3 Octobers ago, in a mudroom off a garage, in the sock of a 6-year-old asleep on a pile of coats. 40 seconds of a house at night. A dog somewhere. A door. Then water running on concrete, and a woman's voice, wrecked, saying, "There was a girl, Vaughn. There was a girl in the road. There was a girl." And then a man's voice, flat and patient and unhurried. The voice of a man moving furniture. "There was a deer." Say it. "There was a deer on Quarry Bend, and you clipped it, and you came home, and you went to bed." Chase. "Get the hose." Elise. "Look at me." Say it. And then a third voice, very young, very far away, saying, "She had a jacket on. She had a red. She had a red." And the first voice again, cutting through. "Nobody in this family says that girl's name in this house again." The recorder clicked off, and the digital display on that $8 pawn shop device, which the court reporter read into the record, said October 19th, 1:07 a.m. There was no sound in courtroom 3B for a moment, and then there was a sound from the back row, and it was Rosa Vega, 3 years of it coming out of her at once, and 2 deputies moved toward her, and Judge Brennan raised one hand, and they stopped where they were and let that woman make that sound in his courtroom for as long as she needed to. And then Harold Brennan turned his head and looked at Naomi Carter, because the tape said 1:07 in the morning, and the sworn affidavit that Naomi Carter had signed at her own kitchen table 19 days earlier, filed in that very building, notarized, said that she had never been in that garage and had seen nothing and heard nothing. A 9-year-old girl had just saved her mother's life and destroyed it inside the same 40 seconds, and she did not know it yet. Pearl turned around on the milk crate to look at her mother, and her face was not a lawyer's face anymore. It was the face of a child who has just understood why her mother had not been sleeping for 3 years, and she said, out loud, in front of 100 people, "Mama, you were there." What Naomi Carter did next, nobody made her do. Her attorney did not advise it. Her attorney tried to stop it. She stood up in the middle of the state's case and asked the court to be sworn. She told all of it. She told them about a check folded once and put in an apron pocket. She told them about the invoices from Boston that came back marked paid. She told them about a garden hose at 1 o'clock in the morning and a man smiling at her, and a cracked headlight, and a streak of red paint the length of her arm, and about saying yes, sir, and about a newspaper folded in half and then in half again and pushed down under the coffee grounds. She told them about the offer in the conference room, and about the $300,000, and about signing her name small on the line at 3 in the morning. She did not excuse 1 minute of it. And then she turned to the second row from the back, and she said this. "I'm not going to sit here and say I was scared, because I was scared. But scared isn't a reason, it's just a feeling. I had a reason. My reason was that I wanted my baby to live, and somebody else's baby was already gone, so there was nothing I could do for her anymore. That's what I told myself. I told myself that for 3 years, and I got good at it. Mrs. Vega, I'm not asking you to forgive me. I know better than that. I'm just telling you your daughter's name has been in my mouth every day since, and I kept it there, and that's mine to carry." Grant Feely asked for a recess. He walked out of that courtroom, and he stood in a stairwell, and then he called Detective Corinne Bayer. When he came back and 90 minutes later, he had the paint analysis, the manufacturer list, the Kellner auto body records showing that Elise Ashworth's vehicle had never been at that shop on any date in October of that year, and an invoice from a body shop in Poughkeepsie, New York, 94 miles away, dated the 22nd, cash, no VIN recorded, for a front fascia and a passenger headlight assembly on a 2020 Land Rover in Indus Silver. His hands shook once when he stood up. He moved to suspend proceedings. He was 34 years old, and it was the first time in his career he had ever understood what he had been used for. Chase Ashworth was 24. He had been 21 in the passenger seat. He had spent 3 years on a prescription he did not need and a boat he never took out. And when the investigators came to him, he did not last 20 minutes. He testified against his father in fragments, unable to complete a sentence, saying the same thing over and over. She had a red jacket. I said it out loud in the car. I said, "That's a person." I said it. I said, "That's a person, Dad." Elise Ashworth was arrested at the house on Bellamy Ridge on a Thursday morning in a bathrobe, and she did not say one word to the officers. And the last thing she did before she got into the car was turn around and look through the crowd on that lawn, searching for a woman who was not there. Vaughn Ashworth was arrested in the corridor outside courtroom 3B, on camera, and he was still smiling, and he was still calling every person in that hallway by their first name. And then the theft case fell apart entirely, because Bayer's people pulled the network logs off the house. All 11 wire transfers had originated from a single desktop in Vaughn Ashworth's home office, at hours when Naomi Carter was 31 miles away, pushing a floor buffer across the second story of a building on Padanaram Road, which was proven by a badge swipe system she did not know existed and by 7 time cards in the name of Bernadette Kowalski. The brooch had never left the property. It had been sitting in the second drawer of that desk for 3 weeks, waiting for a canvas bag to be left on a chair. The charges against Naomi Carter were dismissed with prejudice, and the sound that came out of the gallery was not a courtroom sound, and Bertie Kowalski stood up and yelled something the bailiff pretended not to hear. But she had still lied under oath. This is where a lesser story would end, and this one does not. Naomi Carter was charged with hindering prosecution, and she pled guilty to it, and she refused to let her attorney argue it down, and at sentencing Rosa Vega asked the court's permission to speak. She stood up in nursing home scrubs and said that for 3 years she had gone to that building and sat in the back of rooms where nothing had anything to do with her, because it was the only place she could go where people were still talking about right and wrong out loud. And she said that in 3 years, Naomi Carter was the only person who had ever stood up in one of those rooms and said her daughter's name. And then Judge Harold Brennan took his glasses off, which the people who had practiced in front of him for 26 years had never once seen him do. He said this, "For 26 years, people have walked into this room and told me who is credible and who is not. They tell me with the coat. They tell me with the shoes. They tell me with the size of the woman sitting in the chair, and I have listened to it for 26 years, and I have let it into this room. My mother cleaned rooms at the Renfield Inn for 31 years. She raised 4 children on it, and she is the only person I have ever met in my life who never once lied to me about anything. Mrs. Carter, you lied in my courtroom. I am not going to pretend otherwise, and neither are you. And that right there is the entire difference between you and the man who was walked out of this building in handcuffs on Tuesday, because he would have gone to his grave with it. Suspended sentence. 3 years probation. For 100 hours. And then he looked past her at the second row. Miss Carter, in 26 years on this bench, nobody has ever done in this room what you did in it. Court is adjourned. On the steps of that courthouse in February, in the hard, bright cold, 2 mothers stood about 4 feet apart, and neither of them knew what to do with her hands. Rosa Vega did not say that she forgave her. She never has said it, and she has been asked, and she says that word does not fit what happened, and she is not going to force it. What she said on those steps was this: "Come Thursday. I always make too much on Thursdays. Bring the girl." Naomi Carter went that Thursday. She has gone almost every Thursday since. Vaughn Ashworth was convicted on 11 counts, including evidence tampering, conspiracy, filing a false report, and witness intimidation, and he is serving 22 years. Elise Ashworth pled and testified and is serving 9, and there is a report from a facility in the eastern part of the state that she played a cello once in a day room and could not get through it. Chase Ashworth served 14 months and has since spoken to high school assembly after high school assembly in 3 counties, and he is not good at it, and he does it anyway. The civil settlement was substantial. Most of it went to Rosa Vega and to a scholarship fund in Marisol's name for kids working through school at places like the Dairy Barn. And Rosa Vega, who did not have to do it, who owed that family nothing at all, directed a portion of hers to the surgery. What she said about it was, she wanted to be a nurse, so let her go fix somebody. The myectomy was performed at Boston Children's on the 9th of April. 6 hours and 20 minutes. Naomi Carter sat in a waiting room chair that was built for a smaller woman with a white tube sock in her lap, and did not eat anything, and did not talk to anybody. And when the surgeon came out at 4:10 in the afternoon and said the word beautifully, she put her head down on her knees in front of 30 strangers and stayed there. Pearl Carter is 12 now. There is a thin pink line down the center of her chest about 4 inches long, and she wears scoop necks on purpose, and when people ask about it she tells them, at length, with diagrams if there is paper. She is in 7th grade. She still has the notebook, and she has filled 4 more since, and she says she is going to be a lawyer, and there is not one person who has ever met that child who doubts it. The first thing her mother bought when the settlement cleared was not a car, and it was not the roof. It was shoes. 3 pairs, all at once, at the mall in Danbury, and Pearl picked out a red pair, and her mother put the blue marker in the kitchen drawer and left it there. Last spring there was a state essay competition held in that same courthouse, in that same room, courtroom 3B, and Pearl Carter read hers standing at a podium she can now see over without any help from anybody. In the back row, on the aisle, was a retired judge with a bad hip who had driven 90 minutes that morning and told nobody why he was going. And that night, at a kitchen table on Cortlandt Street with one leg shimmed by a folded playing card, a 12-year-old girl set a scratched silver recorder down between them and pressed the button, because they have a new arrangement now, and the arrangement is that her mother reads and the tape keeps it. Naomi Carter picked it up in a hand that is still cracked across the knuckles, because some things do not wash off no matter how the story comes out. And she read the oyster story the way Isaiah used to read it, badly, doing all the voices wrong, and her daughter laughed at her in the exact same place she has always laughed. Something sharp got inside Naomi Carter on a cold night 3 Octobers ago, and it hurt, and it did not come out. And she did not cry about it where anybody could hear, and she did not spit it out. She put her whole self around it, year after year after year, in the dark, until a 9-year-old girl climbed up on a milk crate in a courtroom in Connecticut and held it up to the light so that an entire county could finally see what it had turned into. They called her the big one, the fat maid, the one they hired for the size of her back. And in 14 years on that hill, not one of them ever worked out that the biggest thing about that woman was never her body at all. It was what she made in there, and it was worth more than everything in that house on Bellamy Ridge put together.